The depot sat alone, like it had been forgotten by the world, a single lopsided building of pale wood with sun-bleached paint peeling in strips. The air was sharp with dust, the kind that rolls across a flat plain in little spirals before breaking apart. No fence, no town, just a leaning water tower, a rutted road leading nowhere in particular, and a patch of hard dirt where the train stopped when it felt like it. Today it had, and now it was gone. The wind came and went in gusts, stirring grit against my boots, and somewhere out past the platform a dog barked once and then thought better of it. I'd come for fence wire and 2 goats, nothing more. It wasn't a day I expected to see anyone I'd remember, but there she was. She sat on the far end of the bench outside the station office, her shoulders curled forward like she was trying to fold herself up and disappear. The dress she wore clung to her in patches from the heat, the bodice torn, showing a strip of pale skin marked by sweat. I could tell the tear wasn't from vanity. It looked like something had pulled at it hard, maybe in a rush to get away. Her shoes were ruined and damp in places they shouldn't be. She kept one hand in her lap, the other shielding her eyes from the midday glare. Even from where I stood, I could see the tremble in her fingers. I don't know how long I watched her before she noticed. Maybe half an hour. My wagon was tied up near the edge of the platform, goats shifting restless in the back. I should have gone inside, got my supplies, headed home. But something in the way she sat still, but not defeated, kept me there. I've seen people give up. This wasn't that. It was more like she'd been pushed past the point of caring who saw her, but some small part of her was still on guard, still taking stock of the ground she sat on. When she finally glanced my way, she didn't flinch, just looked and then looked away again, like she'd already measured me and decided whether I was trouble. I shifted my weight, my bad leg reminding me why I don't crouch fast, and stepped toward her. Up close, I saw her eyes, hazel, swollen but steady, and the tightness in her jaw. She wasn't crying, she wasn't asking. "You'll sleep in my house tonight," I said. It probably sounded strange. No introduction, no explanation. But I meant it the way I said it, plain, without strings. She looked at me like she was waiting for the trick. "What?" "I've got food, water, a spare bed. It's clean, that's all." Her gaze narrowed. "Why?" "Doesn't matter." "I don't want anything from you," she said, like she was warning me. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to." We sat in that silence for a beat. I didn't press her. I wasn't looking to convince. Finally, she stood. That was all the answer I needed. I turned toward my wagon, my limp slow but steady. She followed, and I knew the clerk inside was watching from the corner of his smoke-clouded view, same as he'd been watching her. That man had no interest in where discarded people went. The wagon smelled of goat and dry hay, the sun already heating the boards. I helped her up to the passenger seat without saying a word. She settled in, and I climbed up beside her, took the reins, and gave the mules a low click with my tongue. We didn't talk for the first hour. I've never been much for filling the air. She stared out over the flats brush and dust broken by a tree now and then, nothing else moving but the wind. Every so often I'd glance her way. She didn't look at me. "You always pick up strangers like this?" she asked finally. "No." "Then why me?" "Because you look like you had nowhere else." She didn't answer, and that was fine. Sometimes no answer is the answer. The sun was starting to dip by the time we turned off the main trail. My house came into view, a low stone place, small corral on one side, a pump out front, no fence. I'd never liked the idea of keeping the land penned. I unhitched the goats, tied them off, and opened the door for her. Inside smelled of old wood and cooked beans. The stove was still warm from the night before. "That room's yours," and I told her, nodding down the hall. "There's a basin for washing. I'll leave you be." She hesitated in the doorway, then said, "Thank you." I nodded. Didn't seem like a thing worth more words. She disappeared into the room, and I stoked the fire. I didn't think about what tomorrow would be. Just knew that tonight she'd have 4 walls and a bed, and that was more than she'd had when I found her. That's how it began. Not with a rescue, not with charity. Just 2 people crossing paths at the edge of nowhere, one with a place to sleep, the other with the grit to take it. I didn't know her story yet, didn't know if I'd ever ask, but I knew she wasn't broken all the way through, and I guess she saw something in me that made her stay in that seat. If you've been listening, you know how stories like this don't come from grand gestures, they come from small ones that last. If you want to hear how it went from that bench at the depot to something worth holding on to, stick around. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Sometimes the quietest beginnings lead to the loudest truths. The road home stretched long and empty, the kind of trail where the air sits still between the sound of mule hooves. She hadn't spoken since my last answer, and I didn't press her for more. I could feel the weight she carried in the way she sat upright, but not from pride. It was the kind of posture you keep when you don't trust the ground not to give out beneath you. Her hands stayed folded in her lap most of the ride, though I caught her looking out toward the horizon now and then, like she was trying to measure how far she'd just let herself go from that depot. The mules kept a steady pace, and I let them. The sun sank slow behind the western ridge, turning the sky to a deep, burnt gold. I knew every turn in the trail by heart, every patch where the wheels dipped and jarred your spine. I could have driven it in the dark. A part of me wondered if she was cataloging the route in her head in case she needed to leave. I wouldn't have blamed her if she was. We reached the edge of my land just as the light thinned. A low sweep of stone and cedar brush spread out on either side, and there it was, my place. Not much to look at for someone used to fine walls, but it had stood against every storm that had rolled over it since I stacked the first stone after the war. The house sat low to the ground, built of rock I'd hauled from the creek bed, mortar set by my own hands. Off to the right, the small corral sat empty now, except for a hitch post and a lean-to. The pump was just a few paces from the porch, always within reach, even on a bad leg. I pulled the mules to a halt, climbed down slow, my right knee stiff from the ride. She stayed seated, not out of laziness but caution, like she wasn't sure if stepping down would set something in motion she couldn't undo. I untied the goats, led them toward the pen, and then came back to the wagon. "Come on," I said, offering my hand. She hesitated, then took it, light as if the smallest pull might make her fall apart. Her fingers were cold despite the heat of the day. We stepped onto the porch. The boards gave their familiar creak under our weight, a sound I'd come to take as proof the place was still breathing, right along with me. I pushed the door open. The smell of old wood and last night's beans greeted us, steady and plain. Inside, it was cooler. The walls held the day's heat just enough to keep the air from biting. I could see her eyes moving, taking in the stove, the shelves lined with jars, the table with its 2 chairs, the basin in the corner. No photographs, no trinkets. I'd never needed them. I nodded toward the short hall. "That room's yours. There's a basin for washing. I'll leave you be." She stepped toward it but paused in the doorway. "Thank you." I gave a small nod, not looking to stretch the moment longer than it needed. Gratitude like that isn't something you answer with too many words. The door clicked shut behind her, and I found myself standing still in the quiet. I heard her set her bag down, the soft scuff of shoes against the floorboards. I went to the stove, stoked the embers, and added a small stick of mesquite to keep the heat alive for the night. My hands worked without my mind in them, but my thoughts weren't still. She was a stranger, yes, but not the kind that felt foreign in the room. It was as if the air had already shifted to account for her presence, like the place knew before I did that it wouldn't be just me for the night. I thought about the way she'd sat on that bench, torn dress and all, and how she hadn't asked for help. I've seen the ones who ask, and I've seen the ones who take without asking. She was neither. She'd just been there, and I'd been there too, and somehow that had been enough to bring her here. I sat down in my chair by the table, leaning back until it touched the wall, listening to the small sounds of the house. The boards settle different when there's more than one person under the roof. You can feel it. Through the thin wall, I caught the faint sound of her moving about. No clatter, no rummaging, just careful steps, like she was afraid to leave a mark. I knew that kind of care. It comes from staying in places where your welcome is always in question. The night deepened outside. A coyote yipped somewhere out past the ridge, answered by another farther still. The mules shifted in their hitch, goats quiet in the pen. I thought of the road behind us, the depot fading into dark, the clerk with his ledger and his smoke, the way she'd stood when I didn't give her any reason not to. I wondered if she was lying there staring at the ceiling now, or if the weight she carried had pressed her straight into sleep. Either way, she was under my roof, and in a world that had clearly turned its back on her, that counted for something. I banked the fire, sat a while longer, then rose to check the latch on the door. The habit had stuck with me from the ranger days. When I passed her door, I noticed the light had gone out inside. No movement, no sound. I let her be. That first night, I didn't think about tomorrow or the day after. I didn't think about whether she'd stay or go. I only knew that for the first time in longer than I cared to count, there was someone else in the house, and it didn't feel like a burden. It felt right in a way I couldn't name. Sometimes it's not about knowing a person's story before you open the door. Sometimes it's about knowing you've got enough room to give them a night out of the wind. And maybe, if the ground holds, one night can turn into more. Morning came slow and quiet, the way it does when the night hasn't been broken by wind or worry. I was already up when the first light slid across the ridge, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm before I thought to drink it. I heard her door open soft, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to make noise here. She stepped out wearing a clean shirt and skirt I'd left folded at the foot of her bed, my wife's clothes. I hadn't been certain about the size, but I figured they were better than letting her keep wearing that torn thing from the depot. I hadn't heard her take them, and that told me she'd moved quiet, careful. The kind of careful that comes from too many places where nothing you touched was ever yours. She stopped in the doorway, arms crossed like she didn't know if she was interrupting something. I set the mug down. "Wasn't sure what size you wore," I said, "but that belonged to my wife." Her eyes dropped to the buttons, then back at me. She didn't look embarrassed, just measured, like she was deciding whether wearing another woman's clothes was some kind of test. "Breakfast inside," I added. She moved to the stove without asking questions. On the table, I'd set a pot of beans left from last night, a heel of bread, a tin of water. She ate without a word, steady and neat, and I let her. I'd never been one for morning conversation anyway. When she was halfway through the bread, I leaned against the wall and crossed my arms. "Where were you headed?" She paused, eyes lifting slow. "Nowhere, just away." "From who?" Her jaw tightened. "A family I worked for. They fired me, said I couldn't be trusted around their sons." She hesitated before adding, "It wasn't true." "I didn't think it was," I said. Her gaze sharpened. "You don't even know me." "I know the look in your eyes," I told her. "Same one I had when I came back from the war, like someone already judged you, and you stopped fighting it." The room went still after that. She finished her food without speaking, and when she stood, she looked like she was trying to decide whether to ask what needed doing or just wait for me to tell her. "Water trough's low," I said finally. "Pump's out by the fence. You feel up to a walk?" She didn't hesitate, took the bucket from its hook by the door, and stepped out into the sunlight like she'd been carrying water here for years. I watched her for a moment before following with my own list of chores. The land stretched wide and open under the heat, pale dirt broken by patches of stubborn shrubs. The house looked even smaller from a few steps away, but to me, small had never meant weak. Small meant you could keep your back to a wall and still watch every corner. She worked without needing to be told twice. Filled the trough, checked the pen latch, came back inside without me having to go looking for her. I'd seen men who needed a full day's explanation just to handle one job. She wasn't one of them. The rest of the day fell into a rhythm. She swept the floor, mended a saddlebag I had been ignoring for weeks, and cleaned out the goat pen until the air around it smelled less like waste and more like hay. I replaced a fence post, restrung wire, and fixed a crack in one of the water barrels. We crossed paths here and there, handed each other tools without asking, and didn't speak unless something needed saying. When the sun dipped, she went to her room for a while. I sat with a book I wasn't reading, thinking about the way she moved through the place, how she didn't try to fill it with talk or force her presence into every corner. She left space where space was due. That's a rare thing. Later, over supper, she finally asked, "Why do you live out here alone?" I didn't look up from my plate. "Used to live in town. Wife died. Wasn't much reason to stay after that." "You don't seem like the kind of man who runs," she said. "I don't," I told her. "But I don't invite people either." She studied me for a moment. "So, why me?" I let the quiet stretch before answering. "Because you didn't ask for anything. and you didn't pretend you weren't falling apart. That silenced her, not in the kind of way that shuts a person down, but in the kind that makes them tuck the answer away somewhere safe. When she rose from the table that night, she lingered a little before heading to her room. Her hair was damp from washing. Her shirt clung to her back just enough for me to notice, but I didn't comment. She gave me a small nod. "Good night." I nodded back. There were no promises made that day, no talk of how long she'd stay or what we were to each other. But under the surface, something had shifted. Two people who had no business trusting anyone anymore had found a piece of ground solid enough to stand on, and for the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The days passed quiet, the way I like them, but not the kind of quiet that feels like emptiness. She'd been here long enough now that I'd grown used to hearing the faint scrape of her broom in the other room, the rhythm of her steps across the porch, the soft thud of the bucket when she set it down by the pump. We spoke when we needed to, but it wasn't silence for the sake of distance. It was the kind that leaves space for a person to breathe. Bit by bit, small things came out. Not like she was telling a story, more like she was setting down loose stones between us so we could both walk the same ground. One afternoon, while she was mending a torn strap on my saddlebag, she asked, "You used to be a ranger?" I didn't look up from the harness I was oiling. "Yeah. Why'd you leave?" I worked the oil in slow, thinking how to answer. "You don't get to keep much of yourself in that line of work, and what you do keep, you don't like much." She let that sit for a while, then said, "Your leg?" "Galveston," I told her. Bullet meant for someone else, didn't matter. She didn't press, just tied off the thread on the saddlebag, set it aside, and started on the next thing without looking at me. That's how she was. She'd open a door just wide enough to see through, then leave it alone if you didn't step through yourself. It was a few days later, after supper, that she finally told me how she ended up at that depot. We were sitting at the table, beans and bread between us, the last of the evening light stretching long through the window. "When I was accused," she said, "I thought someone would stand up for me. The lady's husband, maybe the children, someone." I kept my eyes on my plate, giving her room. "They didn't," she went on. "They didn't even look at me. Just packed a trunk and told me to be gone before sunset." Her voice stayed steady, but there was something in the way her hands tightened around the edge of the plate. She'd cried all she had to cry, long before this moment. I let the silence sit until it felt right to speak. "You're here now." "I don't even know what that means," she said. "It means you eat, you sleep, you work, and you don't answer to anyone but yourself." She looked down, her fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. "I don't remember how to feel safe." I leaned back, resting my hands on the arms of my chair. "Neither do I." That stopped her. She looked at me like she was trying to decide if I was telling the truth or just offering comfort. But I don't hand out words I don't mean. Later that night, I was sitting by the small fire, working a blade across a whetstone, when I heard her step into the hallway. She didn't go straight to her room. She stopped at my door, which I'd left open a crack. "You don't have to knock," I said without looking up. "I wasn't going to," she answered. "Good." She came in and sat beside me on the edge of the bed. We didn't touch, not at first, just sat there, both looking straight ahead, like we were waiting for something we couldn't name. After a while, she leaned her head against my shoulder. I didn't move, but I felt something in me shift, the kind of shift that makes a man realize he's been standing in one place a long time. I'd brought her here without knowing her story, and she'd come without knowing mine. Now we had pieces, small, sharp-edged pieces that didn't fit together cleanly yet, but enough to see we'd both been standing outside for too long. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something deeper, slower. Recognition. It rained the next morning. Not hard, not the kind that runs in sheets and turns the ground to muck, just steady enough to tap against the roof and soften the air. We hadn't had rain in weeks, so the sound settled into the house like a guest you didn't mind keeping around. I was at the table with my knife and a strip of leather, working it slow, when she stepped out of her room. She looked different in the light that came through on a gray day hair, pulled back loose, eyes not quite as guarded. She moved toward the stove, rubbing her hands together. "What do you usually do on days like this?" "Same as the others," I said, "just slower." No orders, no lists. She could find her own way through the hours. Sometimes that's more of a gift than people know. Later, I heard her in the storage room. She'd gone into the trunk where I kept linens and odds I hadn't touched in years. She didn't ask, just started sorting and folding, tying bundles back up neat. I stayed where I was and let her. You learn a lot watching how someone handles what isn't theirs. After a while, she came across something I knew was in there, but hadn't seen in a long time. A thin green shawl, hand-stitched, frayed at the edges. She froze when she saw the initials sewn into the hem. Ache. "She made that the winter before she got sick," I said from the doorway. Isabelle turned her head toward me, but didn't set the shawl down. "She seemed careful," she said. "She was," I told her, down to the last thread. I didn't have more to add, and she didn't press me for it. She folded the shawl careful, put it back, and closed the trunk like she understood it wasn't just cloth. When the rain let up, I told her we needed to move the goats into the smaller shelter by the shed. "It's not built for comfort," I said, "but it keeps them dry." We worked side by side without fuss. She held the gate while I shoveled fresh straw. The goats milled around, restless from the weather. Our hands brushed once when we both reached for the same rope. We didn't pull away right off. Just stayed there a second longer than necessary. I felt it, and from the way her breath caught, I knew she did too. While I tightened the shelter latch, she said, "You were a ranger?" "Yes." "Why'd you leave?" I kept my eyes on the latch. "You don't get to keep much of yourself in that job, and what you do keep, you don't like much." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Your leg?" "Galveston. Took a bullet meant for someone else. Didn't matter." She didn't push further, and I was grateful. That night, after we'd finished supper, I was stacking wood by the stove when she spoke again from the basin where she was washing her hands. "Do you want me to go?" I stopped and looked at her. "No." "Not yet?" she asked, voice soft but steady. "Not ever," I said, "if you don't want to." She dried her hands, stepped toward the table. "I'm not used to that kind of choice." "You've got it now." We didn't need to say more. That's the thing about certain truths. They're better left sitting in the open without being picked apart. That night, the rain came back light, whispering against the windows. I lay in bed listening to it, knowing she was just across the hall. Somewhere between us was that green shawl, folded away again, holding a piece of my life I hadn't shown anyone in years. And now she'd seen it, not because I'd offered, but because she'd stepped into the space where it lived and handled it like it mattered. I didn't dream much anymore, but that night I did nothing clear, just a feeling of someone walking beside me down a road that did not have an end I needed to reach. Trust isn't something I hand out, not anymore. It's a thing that takes its own shape over time, like water wearing a groove into rock. And with her, it was happening quiet, without either of us making a point of it. We'd been moving through the days in that same easy rhythm, chores split, without discussion, work done without keeping score. She'd been sleeping in the room at the end of the hall since the night I brought her here. Doors stayed shut, not from secrecy, but from the kind of respect people don't talk about much. That evening, the light had gone early behind the ridge. Supper was just beans again, bread warmed on the stove. She sat across from me, shoulders relaxed more than I'd seen before. I could tell the place was starting to work its way into her bones. That matters when the land and the house start to hold you instead of you holding yourself up against them. She was quiet while she ate, eyes on her plate. Then she looked up at me and asked it straight. "Are you expecting anything from me?" The kind of question most men would hear as an opening, but I knew better. That wasn't invitation, it was defense. I set my fork down, took a slow breath. "No," I said. "Not now, not ever." She studied me like she was looking for the catch. "I won't ask for anything," I went on. "If you give something, it's yours to give." Her eyes didn't soften, but they stopped searching. That's how I knew she heard me. We finished eating without another word. She cleared the plates, and I leaned back in my chair, listening to the sound of her at the basin. There's something in the way she moves, measured, deliberate, not from fear, but from knowing how to survive in rooms where every action can be read the wrong way. I've known that life too. Later, she came back through the main room. I was sitting by the fire, running a whetstone along the edge of my knife. She stopped near my chair. "Good night," she said. "Good night," I answered. She hesitated. Then as she passed me on the way to the hall, her hand brushed my shoulder. Not a stumble, not an accident, just enough to be felt. I kept my eyes on the blade, but I felt the pause in my chest, the way my hand stilled for half a second. I didn't look up until she'd gone down the hall, and when I did, I realized my jaw had gone tight, not from anger, but from something I hadn't felt in a long while, awareness of someone else moving in my space, not as an intruder, but as if they belonged there. The fire cracked, the night settled heavy outside, and for the first time in years, I didn't mind the thought of another day beginning with her still here. Trust was building between us, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet ways people prove themselves, by staying, by showing up again the next morning, by not asking for more than you're ready to give. And I knew, as I banked the fire and headed to bed, that I was already letting her in farther than I'd planned. The wind woke me before the sun, dry and sharp, sliding through the cracks in the old window panes, like it was looking for something to carry off. I lay there a moment, listening to it scrape along the eaves, thinking it was just another restless dawn. Then I heard it, one short, panicked bleat from the goat pen. Another followed quick after. By the time I swung my legs over the side of the bed, I knew what it was. I grabbed the rifle from its place by the door, my other hand finding the lantern. I didn't bother with boots until I was halfway to the porch. The air outside was cold enough to sting, but my blood was already moving. She came out of her room just as I stepped off the porch, barefoot, blanket clutched around her shoulders. "Coyote," I said, pointing to the far side of the pen. "Fence is weak on that end." Two shapes moved quick near the tree line, low and lean, and were gone before I could raise the rifle. No point wasting a shot into the dark. I moved for the pen, lantern swinging. She followed without needing to be told, barefoot over the dirt, like she didn't feel the cold. Two of the smaller goats had huddled together near the shelter, eyes wide and white in the light. One of the older ones was on its side, leg bleeding from a bite just above the joint. I knelt down, set the lantern close, and put my hand on its neck to keep it steady. My leg ached from the crouch, but I didn't move. "You ever doctor livestock before?" I asked without looking up. "No," she said, dropping to her knees beside me, "but I've cleaned up worse." There was something in her tone that made me want to ask what she meant, but this wasn't the time. She pressed her hands down near the wound, steady, despite the slick of blood. I wrapped it quick with the strip of cloth I kept in my coat pocket, then told her to hold it while I fetched rope and a slab of firewood to brace the fence. We worked without talking. She kept pressure on the wound while I patched the gap, the wind tugging at my sleeves, dust lifting around our boots. When we got the goat into the dry corner of the shed, she stayed with it until I came back from checking the rest of the pen. Her hair was coming loose, sticking to her cheek where the cold had brought up color. By the time we stepped back into the house, the sky was starting to pale. I leaned the rifle against the wall, hung my coat, and washed the blood off my hands at the basin. She poured the water without me asking, set the tin cup within reach. "I didn't think you still carried a rifle," she said. "I don't usually," I answered. "So why tonight?" I looked at her for a long moment, the lantern light catching in her eyes. "Because there was something worth protecting." She didn't reply, but I saw the way her breath caught, the way her hand tightened slightly around the edge of the basin. We didn't go back to sleep. I sat at the table, sharpening the knife I'd left out the night before, and she moved about the room quiet, setting things to rights that didn't need it. The house felt different in that early lightless, like mine, more like ours. And I realized, as the sun finally broke over the ridge, that what I'd said was the truth. Somewhere between that depot bench and the coyote in the dark, she'd become part of what I couldn't imagine losing. The day after the coyote trouble, I went about my chores with something sitting heavy in the back of my mind. Not fear, not exactly, but the thought of what might happen if someone came here for her. I'd seen enough in the way she carried herself, in the way her eyes sometimes went distant, to know that disappearing hadn't been her plan. And I also knew from my own past that when you walk away from people who think they own you, they sometimes come looking. By mid-morning, I'd made up my mind. I went to the small cupboard in the corner, reached into the tin box I kept for things I might need in a hurry, took out a small leather pouch and weighed it in my hand before crossing the room. She was standing by the pump outside, sleeves rolled, water dripping from her arms as she filled a bucket for the goats. The sun was just high enough to throw a shine across her hair. When she came back in, I set the pouch on the table between us. "What's this?" she asked. "Money." Her brow furrowed. "For what?" "In case," I said. "In case what?" "In case someone comes. In case you have to go." She stared at me like I'd just spoken in another language. "You want me to leave?" "No," I said, steady as I could. "But I want you to have the choice." She picked up the pouch, turned it over in her hands like it might explain itself. Her jaw tightened before she set it back down on the table. "You gave me shelter," she said quietly. "Food, a room, a name I don't have to run from. I don't need money." I could have argued, could have told her it wasn't about need, it was about not being trapped. But I saw in her eyes that she understood that already. She just wasn't ready to picture herself anywhere else. I let it be, not picking up the pouch, not pushing it toward her again. Sometimes a choice isn't about taking the thing, it's about knowing it's there if your feet start itching to move. That evening, the air was warm enough to work outside after supper. I was checking the fence line, making sure my patch from the night before was holding. She came to the pump, rolled her sleeves again, and worked the handle until the water came up cold and clear. I could hear it splash against the metal pail, smell that clean well scent even from where I stood. When she finished, she stayed there with her hands damp, leaning lightly against the pump. I walked over, boots quiet in the dirt. "You scared?" I asked. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "But you're still here." "I am." We stood there for a moment, the evening settling around us. The wind tugged at her skirt, lifted a strand of hair against her cheek. I don't know what made me do it, maybe the way she met my eyes, maybe the way the day had gone, but I stepped closer and put my hand against her chest, not rough, not holding her there, just feeling the warmth through the thin fabric. "I'm not broken," she said, and there was steel in it. "I was, but I'm not now." "Neither am I," I told her. I let my hand slide up until my fingers rested at the edge of her jaw. No pressure, no demand, just presence. She didn't move away. That was the first real touch between us that wasn't by accident or necessity. Not pity, not desperation, just two people standing where they'd chosen to be. Later that night, she sat with me by the fire. Our knees were almost touching, my hand resting near hers on the arm of the chair. We didn't speak much. When she rose to go to bed, I stood too, walked her to the hallway. I didn't touch her again, but when she turned back before stepping into her room, I was still there, still watching, still staying. And that, I realized, was as much of a promise as either of us had made since the day I found her at that depot. The nights had been settling quieter lately. She moved through the house like she'd been here a long while, knowing where things belonged without asking, slipping into the rhythm of the place as if she'd always known it. I caught myself noticing the little things, how her sleeves stayed rolled when she worked at the pump, the way she leaned against the fence for a moment after carrying water, the small crease in her brow when she was thinking, but didn't want to be asked about it. It was after supper one evening, the air still warm from the day, that something shifted between us. We'd eaten in that steady silence I'd grown to like, the kind that didn't press for talk but still felt full. Her foot brushed mine under the table, not much, just enough for me to notice. I didn't move it away. Later, while she was at the basin washing the dishes, I leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You used to sing," I said. She glanced over her shoulder. "How would you know?" "You hum sometimes, in the barn, same pattern, same breath." She turned back to the water, and I saw the smallest smile touch her mouth. "I sang when I taught the children. It made them remember better." She shook her head, more to herself than to me. "Now, I'm afraid if I open my mouth too much, everything will come out at once, and I won't be able to stop it." I didn't answer, just let the sound of the water and her voice linger in the space between us. That night, after the fire had burned low and the lamps were dim, she didn't go straight to her room. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, shirt off, cleaning a shallow cut along my arm from a strand of barbed wire I'd caught earlier in the day. When she stepped in, I looked up but didn't move. "You sure?" I asked. She nodded once. "I've never been more." I didn't stand, didn't close the space for her. I let her come to me. She stepped forward slow, one hand resting on my shoulder. Her palm was warm, steady. She looked at me fully, no hesitation in her eyes, and I let her see me the same way, every scar, every gray line in my beard, every mile I'd carried alone. When she leaned in, our first kiss wasn't rushed. It wasn't about hunger. It was about decision. Her hands stayed on my chest, not pulling, not pleading, just being there. My own hands settled at her hips, my thumbs pressing lightly into the fabric of her skirt. When we lay down, it wasn't desperate. It was slow, like we'd both been waiting to be sure. I unbuttoned her shirt one by one, not because I was uncertain, but because every button felt like a choice. When I touched her, I did it like she was something real, not fragile, not claimed, but her own. We didn't speak afterward. She stayed in my bed, curled against my side, her hair falling loose across my chest. Outside, the wind shifted through the yard, the old shutter knocking once against the wall. Inside, the air was still. Sometime before dawn, she whispered, "I'm not going anywhere." I tightened my arm around her just slightly. "You're home now." It wasn't a question. When morning came, I woke before her. The light coming in was soft, turning the room gold in places. She was still there, breathing even, one hand resting against my ribs. I lay still, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of what we'd both stepped into. I'd spent years keeping my life pared down to what I could carry alone. But looking at her in that light, I knew I'd already stopped thinking of it that way. She wasn't something I'd found by accident. She was someone I'd let in, slow, cautious, but all the way in. And I realized the choice I'd given her the other day, that pouch of money for the road, wasn't just hers. I'd made my own choice when I didn't take it back. The morning after she first stayed in my bed, the horizon brought dust. Not from the wind, this was thicker, heavier, moving steady from the south. I spotted it through the front window before the sun was high. Riders, 3 of them. She was at my side in seconds, her eyes narrowing when she saw them. "They're not here for you," I said, but I wasn't certain. She didn't need me to be. She just stayed there, breathing slow, her hand gripping the edge of the table like she meant to anchor herself to the floor. By the time the riders reached the yard, I was already on the porch. I didn't take the rifle. Not yet. I stood at the top of the steps, arms loose, my weight balanced the way it had been in more standoffs than I cared to count. The lead man reined in, coat dusty, eyes sharp. "You Concincaid? Who's asking?" "I'm here for a woman, Isabelle Mercer. Family wants her returned, quietly if possible." "She's not here." His mouth curved just enough to show he didn't believe me. "We saw her through the window." I stepped down one stair, slow, my limp steady but unshaken. "Then you know she's not leaving." "You hiding her?" "I'm standing beside her." That's when she came out, not behind me, beside me. Her voice didn't waver. "You can go back and tell them I'm not coming. They had their chance. I did nothing wrong." The man's gaze flicked between us. "They say you were inappropriate, a corrupting influence. That's what the wife says." "Then the wife can rot in the bed she made," she answered. I didn't look at her, but I felt the weight of those words. I kept my eyes on him. "You really want to stake your land on this woman's word?" he asked. "I've staked it on worse and better," I said, "but this ain't about the land." We stood there until he clicked his tongue and turned his horse. The other 2 followed, their dust trailing behind them until it faded into the ridge. Only then did I let my shoulders drop. She exhaled, her knees nearly giving, but she didn't cry. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," I told her. "I did." That night, we worked side by side on the fence again, passing nails and tools without words. After supper, she stood in the doorway and said, "I want to make something of this place, a garden, chickens, maybe a schoolroom one day for the little ones. We could teach them here." I studied her face. She wasn't dreaming to escape. She was building. "I'll dig the plots in the morning," I said. "Don't do it alone," she answered. "I won't." When we lay down that night, her hair spilled loose across the pillow, her hand resting on my chest. "You sleep here every night now," I said. "I don't sleep anywhere else," she told me. It's a strange thing how a life can shift without any grand announcement. I'd lived years thinking my world was fixed, just me, the land, the animals, the work. Then one afternoon at a depot, I saw a woman who looked like she had nowhere else, and I opened my door. That was all, but the truth is, it wasn't just her life that changed. She brought something with her, something I didn't think I wanted anymore. Noise in the mornings, a second cup on the table, another set of hands in the work, and a reminder that a home isn't just a roof and four walls, it's who chooses to stay inside it. I've learned that trust doesn't come all at once, it comes in pieces. A shirt left folded on a bed, a hand on your shoulder when you're not expecting it, a shared silence that says more than words ever could. And I've learned that you can't keep someone by holding on too tight. You keep them by giving them the choice to leave and finding they'd rather not. If you'd asked me months ago whether I'd stand in my own yard facing down armed men for someone I barely knew, I'd have told you I wasn't in the business of saving anyone. But this wasn't about saving. It was about standing beside. And there's a difference. I know now that I wasn't just giving her a place to stay. I was letting myself have one again. And that's a harder thing to admit than it sounds. So here we are. The garden will go in soon. Chickens by summer if the foxes don't get bold. Maybe, if she means it, a schoolroom for the little ones that find their way here. And I'll keep patching fences and hauling water because that's what the land asks. She'll keep tending to the things that grow because that's what her hands are made for. And maybe one day, years from now, I'll remember the sound of her voice at that depot, saying nothing at all, but still telling me she wasn't done yet. If you've listened this far, maybe you understand that this isn't just a story about a woman finding a safe place. It's about a man remembering that he could still open the door. If that means something to you, then you know the lesson. We're not built to weather everything alone, no matter how much we tell ourselves we are. So if you've taken something from this, give something back, like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel. Not for me, but because stories like this only matter if they're told, and only keep living if someone's there to hear them. You never know who might be standing at their own depot, waiting for someone to see them.